Hello and welcome to the HR People Pod, the CIPD's fortnightly podcast, bringing you the topical stories and expert insights impacting the profession and the world of work. My name is David D'Souza. I am Director of Profession at the CIPD, and I'm delighted that we can bring you a special guest today in our series of bringing you exceptional thinkers. So joining me, not quite in the studio today, but live from his home, we've got an author and highly acclaimed speaker in the field of high performance, a multi-award winning journalist and Olympian, someone who left school at the age of 16 to focus on table tennis. Is that correct, Matthew?
That is, David. Great to connect. I hope the signal holds up because we've had a few problems, but it's great to have this conversation. I love what you're doing at CIPD, and you're right. You're right. I left school to play table tennis, much to my father's, what's the right word here? Disappointment isn't strong enough. He was more than disappointed. He said, Matthew, table tennis won't last a lifetime. And he was right about that. I realised in my late 20s, as I'm slowing down, that I'd have to reinvent. But it's sort of a coherent journey, really, because in table tennis, although it's quite a small sport in the UK, it's quite big globally, quite competitive. So as often, one's life was about trying to improve, to be the best that one could be, to perform under pressure. And then when I stopped playing table tennis, somewhat after the Olympic Games in Sydney, I started writing about those kinds of topics. And it's really been a great journey of trying to understand not just individual performance, but team performance and performance of organizations, the cultures that can support them, and also societies. What makes societies function well. I try and look at that as much as possible in my Sunday Times column. It's been a strange journey at times, and when I look back now, I still find it difficult to believe how long I invested in table tennis, because it was sort of the main thing in my life between the ages of about 8 and 32, which philosophically, spending that amount of time hitting a plastic ball over the net. Yeah, it's been a bit surreal.
And do you often wake up at night thinking, should have spent that time in a different way? Or are you very content with where you've ended up now?
I often dream. I have an anxiety dream where I'm due on to play a match at 9 a.m. and I'm trying to get to the tournament. And it sort of takes me back to when I used to be driven to tournaments by my wonderful mum, who I had Sunday lunch with yesterday. And she used to take me and my brother Andrew to tournaments, in the Cotswolds or in Cleveland or in Birmingham, Tunbridge Wells. There was a big tournament there. And the real fear was not getting to the tournament on time, because if you didn't get there on time, you got scratched. And you would have this announcement on the tannoy in these municipal sports halls, Matthew Syed to table 7 within 2 minutes, or he will be scratched. And I hear that voice in my head, and I wake up thinking, I've got to get to the tournament. So that's what sort of seems to be playing on my mind. So in my dreams, I'm still a dedicated table tennis player, oddly enough.
My schoolhood memories would be just forgetting about exams altogether. So a reminding voice would have been very handy. So take inspiration from blockbusters like Avengers: Infinity War, Endgame, and Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. And Squid Games, we're splitting this conversation into two. So two distinct parts, if you're listening. Across both episodes, we'll be focused on high performance, but we'll look at it from an individual standpoint, and we'll look at it from an organizational one. So you spoke about both of these things at the Festival of Work, the CIPD's event this summer, in a really well regarded and welcomed keynote. But if we start off with that kind of the individual and the mindset, do you consider that high performance mindset to be a rare thing? Or do you consider that to be something everyone's got access to, and maybe it just takes a bit of training and discipline to access?
I loved that event, by the way, at the Excel.
Yeah, we first met when you were speaking at our annual conference years ago up in Manchester. So it's nice to be able to kind of connect again now.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Didn't we talk in the bar at the Radisson Hotel?
Yeah, for hours. And at one point,
Yeah.
I'm happy to, always a bit false to any of our listeners. I started lecturing you on how I thought Jose Mourinho would do next year, forgetting that I think you were the sports journalist of the year at the time. So, yeah, very in-depth conversation.
I love the event at the Excel because wasn't just the event itself, as afterwards I sort of hung around and talked to the audience, all of whom were so interesting on culture. And so I learned a lot from those chats, and it reflects one of my books that diverse perspectives often create a far bigger and richer information space than just having a group of people who think in the same way. But on the question of individual mindset, I think this idea of a growth mindset is very, very important, because effectively it's people. I mean, there's a lot of ways to go into what the growth mindset is, but I think it's particularly significant in the world today, a world of change and dynamism and complexity. Because what it means is what we're currently doing is likely to be superseded by new ways of doing things, new technologies that can inform the way we're currently doing things, and therefore having a mindset that enables you to be willing to adapt, to respond to new information, to try things and to fail, and to overcome some of the complacency that we can easily drift into, I think is very, very important. And so individuals can cultivate a growth mindset. So it's something which is a bit different to personality, which, if not completely set in stone, is rather more fixed. Our mindsets can change, and cultures can help people to shift their mindset.
There's obviously a body of work that sits behind this. There's a degree of contention, I think, around some of the evidence in there. But it does also seem pretty common sense in terms of the fact that if we do not practice at things, we will not be able to excel at them. And if we do not believe that practice will make a difference, we won't even try. So there's something in that heart, as you say, of believing that you can be better as an individual to even have a chance to advance.
Good way to think about it is to get a big picture story in here is the history of science. And I think most historians would agree that science didn't advance very much between the time of, at least in Western science, between the time of the ancient Greeks and the scientific revolution. And one reason for this, I think they were quite fixed. They thought that the Earth was the center of the solar system, that it was 6,000 years old, and a range of other dogmas. And if there was any evidence that showed that this might be incorrect, the people who provided that evidence were often shunned or even killed, what you might call a high blame culture. And of course, if one becomes fixated on a particular way of thinking about the world, it becomes very difficult to adapt. And it was only when scientists said, okay, yeah, we have good models of the world, but they can be improved, that they started performing experiments. Experiments really are a form of curiosity. You're trying to find out what you don't know. And that requires a willingness to recognize that what we currently know can be superseded. And so we're going to test our hypotheses. And if they fail, that will set the stage for coming up with richer and more explanatory hypotheses. And so I think science itself, not unlike biological evolution, is just a process of testing, learning, and adapting. And I think we can introduce that into our own lives to an extent. And that as we learn and adapt and reinvent, we just have a more interesting journey in life, but also the one that can be much more productive.
So at the heart of that is an assumption that people shouldn't be complacent. Or at least if you are complacent, there's a natural level that you will reach and you will not supersede. How detrimental can complacency be? Where if we think about individuals initially, how much of a limiter do you think that is to people achieving their genuine potential?
I think it can happen with organizations and individuals that have had success. So I think I mentioned in the speech at Excel, this is what Satya Nadella diagnosed at Microsoft when he became CEO in 2014, that they had had success historically, and they had understandably thought, we're pretty good, we're developing prestige, we're getting the answers right. And there's nothing wrong with being successful, but it can, in cultural and psychological terms, lead to complacency. You know, we've got the answers, and therefore there's nothing more to learn. And he described Microsoft at that time as an organization that had become a group of know-it-alls, where people's self-esteem became bound up with being the smartest person in the room, which again isn't necessarily a bad thing to want to look smart. But if one's ego or self-esteem is bound up with having the answers correct, never making mistakes, being smarter than anyone else, the kind of expertise that one associates with omniscience, then one becomes very threatened by failures. Because instead of seeing that as an opportunity to learn and adapt, it becomes threatening to one's ego and one doesn't want to hear about it, or to hearing about the deficiencies in the product line or the next advertising campaign. Because if one was the originator of that campaign, again, it can be a threat. Or if somebody else comes up with an incredible idea, which is the purpose of teamwork, but that idea didn't emerge from my own brain, again, that person's trying to look smarter than me. And people in those circumstances can send off signals that shuts down the open exchange of ideas and constructive dissent that is a cornerstone of effective teamwork and of a related phenomenon, forgive the jargon, sometimes called psychological safety, which I think is a very big deal, by the way, psychological safety. Nadella said we really need to shift from an organization of know-it-alls, complacent, not being adaptive, not effectively functioning as a team, to an organization of learn-it-alls, which sounds a bit naff, admittedly, but when one is a learn-it-all, one can still be an expert, but one is seeking to connect that expertise with new knowledge, new technologies, new information, new insights, to bring the collateral of the wider team to the cross-germination of ideas. And I think it was that cultural unlocking of the talents at Microsoft that really transformed its trajectory under this extraordinary journey under Nadella. And it does map, I think, onto the scientific revolution, where there's just this extraordinary flowering of knowledge, of testing and learning, multidisciplinary work. I think, these are obviously big picture characterizations I'm giving, but I do think it's worth being aware of how complacency can set in. And I measure my mindset every 6 months because every now and again it sets in with me. You introduce me as a great thinker. It's lovely to hear it, but my goodness, how easy to sit back and think, and just to stop learning and to stop engaging with the extraordinary research that's out there. And I do that all the time. So I like to have that little wake up call, that little internal monitor. Because the other thing worth saying is I think that life of intellectual adventure and change is a really, and this is an independent point really, a much more interesting and engaging one. But it's worth saying that moving from the fixed to the growth mindset, it's not just about overcoming complacency. I think we can also put limitations on ourselves that maybe we're not good enough to adapt and grow. We don't have the talent. We don't have the potential. We can be held back by imposter syndrome. And I think of when I was moving from playing table tennis into writing. When I wrote my first piece for the Times and got invited to give a speech at Goldman Sachs, and I'd done very little public speaking before. I went to a comprehensive school, and I remember being weighed down with imposter syndrome, thinking, what on earth can a table tennis player say to a group of traders? And I didn't do very well. It didn't go down as well as I hoped. I prepared hard, but I didn't really have the social confidence or the eloquence, frankly, to really deliver a great speech. So I read it out. And I remember leaving that and realizing it hadn't gone down brilliantly and thinking, what, if I'm ever asked to give a speech again, I'll just decline. I haven't got the gift. And that is a fixed mindset response because people, I should have really explained this earlier, but people in a fixed mindset at an unconscious level tend to associate success with talent. And therefore, any failures evidence that you lack talent, quite a binary thing. And therefore, it can become rational to give up. But then I thought, let's have a growth mindset response to this. And I got a friend to Google public speaking practice. And I went to this club called Toastmasters, where you can practice in front of a group of like-minded and often really supportive people. And I just got better and better at not becoming the best speaker in the world, but improving my ability to read a room, to speak without notes, to answer questions. And I was very passionate about that because I knew that journalism is what I wanted to do, and I might occasionally get asked to go on the radio or podcasts. And it just was remarkable to me how much capacity we often do have for change, particularly, yes, the technical skills, but the non-technical skills too. How to conduct a meeting, how to listen well, how to build rapport, how to sell, how to communicate in public. These are eminently learnable skills, but I suppose the willingness to practice them and to build up that capability is sort of presupposed by a belief in our capacity to learn, which is really the point that you were making, that it can lead to a certain type of self-efficacy. And as I say, it doesn't mean we all become the best communicators in the world because, I'm not the best. It just means we get to be the best that we can be. That's got remarkable dynamical power within a company or a team or an ecosystem.
So you're talking about you developed a discipline of kind of self-reflection at least every 6 months. You've got areas that you can work on and develop, and you're committing time and effort to them. If someone was listening to this now, and public speaking is a brilliant example because it is the one that seems to strike fear into otherwise absolutely expert people, is the idea of sharing that expertise with others. Where would you start? You said Toastmasters, but that initial step, that initial resolve, that's at the heart of the mindset that you're talking about, isn't it?
Toastmasters was a game changer for me. I was lucky enough to be a member of a group just over the bridge from where I am now in Twickenham, southwest London, Riverside Communicators. And it was just 10 or 15 people like me trying to improve their communication skills. And I bumped into a few of them over the year. I went for 4 or 5 years, slowly building up because it was very important for me as a journalist to be able to communicate verbally, because I did get invited onto the Today programme or more recently onto Question Time. And I wanted to be able to get what was in my brain across to other people verbally, to think on my feet. My goodness, these were learnable. It's funny, I did a podcast with Robbie Savage and Freddie Flintoff. And, one of them had gone from cricket into broadcasting, the other from football. But what they both had, they weren't necessarily the best communicators, but they had incredible growth mindsets. So Robbie had a teleprompter in his home. So he was practicing trying to read a teleprompter while listening because that's what you have to do as a presenter. You're having to multitask. Fred, who was becoming an ever more brilliant broadcaster, and he actually got the Top Gear big gig, off the back of the podcast we did. He went on a musical theatre tour, singing in front of audiences to overcome his self-consciousness. And, we can forge those kinds of opportunities. Toastmasters is brilliant to do that, by the way, because you get an opportunity to speak in public, every second week if your club meets we met every second Wednesday, and you'll just be amazed at how much you improve. But we only have a limited amount of time in the day. I would say focus on those things that you think are going to be really fun, enjoyable, career enhancing, helping you pursue your purpose, and allocate a bit of time for it. In our busy lives, it's part of how we grow.
And it's inevitable that you won't grow if you don't. So to your point, there's that self-limiting assumption that some people have, that this is as good as it gets.
Yeah.
But for anyone listening to this, I think there's a few things really interesting that have kind of come up. You talked about keeping pace with the scientific revolution and that notion of experimentation. And that's really important for practitioners. We have to keep learning more. We have to keep challenging our assumptions. And you used the word dogma earlier. I think that's a really important thing for the profession as a whole. But just to take it back, because you've written a number of books that deal with the themes that we've kind of spoken about. And I know we've spoken a lot around purposeful practice in this, which would have been the kind of heart of Bounce. But equally, one of the books I've seen most in HR professionals' libraries, sneaking you see the cameras in kind of people's houses now, and you get to see what's on the bookshelf, is black box thinking. And you just want to touch, because one of the things that can really cause damage to people's careers is where mistakes absolutely derail them. So you see someone make a mistake, and then the next year is just them recovering from the mistake. You write a lot in black box thinking around people's that ability to take a mistake and turn it into learning. So if there's something that someone could do to improve with growth mindset, how do you personally cope with mistakes?
One of the international editions of Black Box Thinking had a subtitle, why failure is good, which isn't quite right, is it? I mean, you don't necessarily want to play in the Olympic Games and just lose really easily, make loads of mistakes. I try and make this argument in black box thinking. You really, I think, need to apply a strategic lens to making mistakes and what failure means. I mean, I'm flying abroad next week, and I wouldn't necessarily want the pilot on final approach to think, I'm going to try a new lever today and potentially crash the plane. We wouldn't say to the pilot, if they survived the crash, well done for trying something new and innovative. We'd probably prosecute them for gross negligence. If a pilot had a hunch about maybe changing the way they interact in final approach, we wouldn't want them to test it in a real live flight. We'd want them to test it in a simulator. That way you get all the benefits of learning from failure without anyone dying. Or a retail company wouldn't necessarily bet the equity of the business on, a hunch that if we change the configuration of the shelves, we're going to improve customer experience. But if they test it in the pilot scheme, they might get lots of benefits from learning, but without jeopardizing too much value. And I think, for what it's worth, people in a fixed mindset empirically are more likely to test pilot schemes in very conducive conditions, with the best manager, best area, best customers, because they're trying to corroborate, if you like, the hypothesis, but they don't learn very much. It's important to test rich hypotheses. You're always trying to maximize the benefits of learning while minimizing the downside cost. Toastmasters is a good example of that. You can fail loads of times in front of a group of friends, and it doesn't really have much impact on your career. And then you can hopefully take a more skilled capability and communication into the real world. And I think that strategic lens is very important. I watched a podcast a few days ago with Demis Hassabis of DeepMind, and he made a really fantastic point that when we fail, and AI is obviously designed to do this well, you really want to split the hypothesis space. You want to come up with a conjecture. But if a hypothesis is sufficiently rich that you're dividing the hypothesis space in two. So of all the infinite possibilities out there, the hypothesis that you test tells you that either half of these infinite possibilities are wrong or that they're right, then a success or a failure has the same meaning. And he also made the point, and it's a point that E.O. Wilson made, that if you test a trivial hypothesis, you get a trivial answer. The real art, if I can put it that way, in science is to come up with very rich conjectures. Now, that is something Hassabis said that AI is not yet capable of doing. AI is very good at testing hypotheses, but it isn't yet good at coming up with interesting conjectures. But I suppose, long story short, I think the way we frame failure has to be around trying to maximize the benefits from learning from potential failure while minimizing the downside cost. That's true of failing fast in Silicon Valley, by the way. They're not failing randomly with these prototypes or minimum viable products. They're testing them such that they are able to make much bigger strides forward with each failure. So there has to be a strategic lens in how we fail and fail well.
Yeah, move fast and break things is about understanding actually what works and what doesn't at pace. Like you say, it's not the aim isn't to just break things. That would be a very strange thing to aspire to as an organization. I'm going to ask you for just two things that you recommend anyone listening to this podcast do around their own personal disciplines or performance. And then we'll wrap it up and we'll look forward to the organizational version of this coming out a little bit later.
Well, the slightly self-serving here. I take Mindset Advantage, which is the tool that me and my team have designed to test my mindset every 6 months. It's a really useful check for me, drifting into complacency or having failed to not collaborate well or not building out new skills. It's just a really good thing that I do. And then why not try something and that you're likely to fail at? I think we sometimes catastrophize failures that actually don't mean much. Like if in the early days of Toastmasters I'd messed up when the consequence was actually quite low and I thought I'm never going back there again, it doesn't matter that much. I think just failures are part of life, and just reinterpreting it sometimes can be a real boon to our own mental health as much as anything else.
It's caring enough to try and not caring so much that it's going to be an anchor. I think it's that balance that you're kind of talking about there, isn't it? So you put the effort in with Toastmasters, but it was never going to be the thing that stopped you dead in your tracks. And that's a difficult
Yeah, I
balance
love
for any
that.
professional to carry.
I really like that, and I think particularly of young people who there was a finding in psychology a few years ago, the curse of perfectionism, that kids in a world of social media where people are posting their best lives and looking perfect and airbrushed pictures, if kids start thinking that life's about being perfect or acting perfectly, they'll just be paralyzed by not wanting to try new things, not asking questions in class because I didn't understand that. Well, what? But by not asking questions about something you didn't understand, it means you're perpetuating your lack of understanding. When I was at Oxford, even back then, there were, I would ask, I saw that, I suppose I had a bit of a growth mindset back then because if I didn't understand, I really felt that I ought to ask the tutor or the lecturer. Fantastic to get that feedback. But there are others that really wanted to look good in the eyes of the lecturer by not asking the question. But of course, it meant, when they got to the final exams, there often were gaps in knowledge. There was another thing that fascinated me is that in the build up to the exams at Oxford, there were some people who were very conspicuously in the quad drinking Pimm's. And I was like, why are they not? We've been here for a few years. You might as well do your best in the exam. I mean, it seemed to me a sensible thing to do. And I came across this phenomenon of self-handicapping, where people are so worried about potentially failing that they try and proactively construct an excuse in advance of the test.
Yeah, see quite a bit with interviews where people just put themselves in a position where it's likely they'll fail. So it's a lovely defense
Yeah.
mechanism. The reason I failed wasn't I wasn't good enough or I wasn't a good
Yeah,
enough fit. It's just, this
right.
happened on the day or I wasn't able to prep. Um, Thank you for this. It's been a brilliant first episode. Just a reminder, there will be a second one following hot on its tracks. We will include links to a number of the resources kind of mentioned within this. As I say, Matthew's books will be a lovely addition to any of your bookshelves. It's the way that I will position it. And remember that we publish new episodes of this podcast every fortnight. So you can catch up with anything on demand. My name's David D'Souza. This has been the HL People Pod. But thank you so much to our guest, Matthew Syed, for all of his thoughts on how you can be a better performing professional. Thank you.